What is the nature of these textual variants, these thousands upon thousands of variants that we have among our New Testament manuscripts? If one just had the number of 400,000 to 500,000 variants, one might think there's no way we could possibly get back to the original text of the New Testament. But when you examine the nature of these variants, now things come into view that you might not otherwise recognize. Here's a way we can categorize these variants. We can do it into 4 different groups. And the 2 poles on each of these groups, or in this categorization, is meaningful on the one hand and viable on the other. By meaningful, what I mean is that it changes the meaning of the text to some degree. By viable, I mean that it has the likelihood or the possibility, a distinct possibility of going back to the original wording, and that means it has to be found in sufficient manuscripts, either that are early enough or important enough, or that could plausibly go back to the wording of the original. You could refer to an earlier lesson on Matthew 27, 16 and 17 that has some fairly late manuscripts, but they are significant enough that they could go back to the original because they are belonging to their own textual family, and so that would be considered a viable variant. So meaningful and viable are the 2 poles, and here's the way we can categorize all textual variants. First, those that are neither meaningful nor viable. Second, those that are not meaningful but are viable. Third, those that are not viable but are meaningful. And fourth, those that are both meaningful and viable. Well, let's examine these in this order. First, we'll start with those that are neither meaningful nor viable. That means that it doesn't affect the meaning of the text, and they don't have much plausibility of going back to the original. In fact, we'll take this category with the next one, those that are not meaningful but are viable, and we'll group those 2 together. Well over 75% of all of our textual variants belong to these 2 categories. The most common kind of change we have among our manuscripts are spelling changes, and the most common spelling change we have among the manuscripts is what's called a movable nu. This is the use of the letter N at the end of a word when the next word starts with a vowel. Do I put the letter N in there when I have a vowel afterwards? Well, just like in English, we have a book, an apple. So in Greek, you have a movable nu before a word that starts with a vowel. And the older manuscripts always had that nu there. They didn't take it off. The later manuscripts start to nuance it, so they would drop the nu when the next word started with a consonant. That's the most common textual variant we have among our New Testament manuscripts. It affects nothing. And so spelling differences, especially those that are not meaningful but may or may not be viable, account for a good 75% of all of our textual variants. The next group, those that are meaningful but not viable, is a significant group, and it's again, this will probably be about 24%, or really more than 24%, of all of our textual variants belong to this category. They are variants where it makes for a significant change in the meaning of the text, but there's hardly any plausibility that that wording could go back to the original. It may be found in one late medieval manuscript, or one group of versions that don't have a very good pedigree, or a few church fathers that talk about a variant, but they don't really go back to the original. One of the interesting ones is in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, and this really borders on neither meaningful nor viable, but in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, Paul says to the Thessalonians that we were little children among you, or he says we were gentle among you. Now those 2 variants are both meaningful and viable. It changes the meaning of the text whether Paul says we were gentle among you or we were little children. And many scholars would say it has to say gentle because it goes on, it says like a nursing mother. And so does this mean that Paul is saying we were little children among you like a nursing mother? That would be too harsh of a metaphorical shift for Paul. He does some things like this elsewhere, but not quite that extreme. Or if you repunctuate the text, you could say, we were little children among you, period. Like a nursing mother cares for her children, something along those lines. Paul goes on and says that. So if you put a hard stop there, there is not nearly as disruptive a metaphor shift. However, gentle and little children, there's only one letter difference in Greek. It's either napioi or apioi. And the word that precedes it ends with a nu. So in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, we have egenethemen napioi or egenethemen apioi. But read together, egenethemen napioi, what did I say? Did I say napioi or apioi? It's very difficult to tell, and consequently, this has created an extremely difficult textual problem for scholars to try to figure out. But there's another variant that sounds like apioi, sounds like napioi, but it's sufficiently different that it could not have been created quite in the same way that these were created. And it only occurs in one late manuscript. It's the word hippoi. We became horses among you. Now, it's a funny variant, and it's obvious that Paul and Silas could not have become horses in any capacity, no matter what you're thinking about. That makes no sense here. So most would say that's not a meaningful variant at all. But it may be that we've got a disgruntled USC fan when USC lost the Rose Bowl against the University of Texas in 2005. And so he says we became horses among it. Who knows? But whatever the reason is, this is not at all a viable variant. There are plenty of these non-viable variants that are meaningful, but they just don't have a sufficient pedigree to go back to the original text. The smallest category of variants is those that are both meaningful and viable. This is less than 1% of all textual variants are both meaningful and viable variants. That is, they have some good plausibility, a good possibility of going back to the original, and they change the meaning of the text to some degree. Let me give an illustration of a textual variant that is both meaningful and viable. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, we read that the number of the beast is 666. Everyone knows the Antichrist number is 666. Well, not so fast. There's a manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It's a 5th century manuscript, and it's probably our second most important manuscript for the book of Revelation. And it has the number of the beast as 616. Most scholars think 616 is not the number of the beast, it's the neighbor of the beast. You know, he lives a few doors down. But with one manuscript, it didn't seem like it had much plausibility, except that Irenaeus, the 2nd century church father, spoke about textual variants, and he spoke specifically about this textual variant, and he said, the better manuscripts, the earlier manuscripts that I've seen have 666, but there are some that have 616. So the number 616 we know existed in the 2nd century because Irenaeus is writing in the late 2nd century. But we also know that he is commenting on this, thinking that the better manuscripts have 666. So its pedigree may not be as good as that, but it may well be that Irenaeus is motivated to say that the number is 666 instead of 616. Up until a few years ago, this was the only manuscript that we actually had that had the number of the beast as 616. But then at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, they found another manuscript that had been excavated decades ago and had been in the library waiting for some papyrologists to go through and examine these documents. And this manuscript also has the number of the beast as 616. It is now our earliest fragment for Revelation chapter 13 in its 3rd, possibly 4th century, but it says 616 like this other manuscript in Paris says. And so consequently, here's a reading that is both meaningful and viable. It has a sufficient pedigree to possibly go back to the original text. We have to examine this in terms of external evidence and internal evidence to make the decision. And yet, when the day is done, we may not have a very strong feel as to which wording is original. Most likely 666 is, but it may be that some scholars can make a great case out for 616 going back to the original text. It's going to take hundreds of hours of research to determine this, and even when it's all over with, there's not absolute certainty as to what the original text is. But it's a meaningful variant. It's the kind of a variant that if English Bibles and Bibles in other languages translated this as the number of the beast is 616, it would probably send several tons of popular Christian literature to the flames. Just Google 616 or Google 666 sometime on the internet, and you'll discover all sorts of crazy ideas about what 666 is all about. But if it says 616, then all bets are off. Now they have to go back and do their strange rantings about these mysterious numbers.